And it looks like the counter has stopped. So that means it's time for us, our guest, but also a special guest in back of us, which we will introduce to you, or whom we will introduce to you. I'm not sure which it is in a few moments, but I want to welcome all of you. Of course, I'm Jay Frost. This is the Philanthropy Mastermind series, and we are live in London, which is a very exciting place to be, especially with our guest today. So I want to welcome all of you to this party and encourage you to participate in the conversation. You can do that, of course, as you just saw, through the chat or through the Q&A. And we had a very lively discussion yesterday, so I hope you'll make today's just as good back and forth as we had yesterday. You can do that once again along the bottom of your screen, so do look for those cues if you would. And in fact, if you wouldn't mind just warming that up for us, and in fact, I can see Catherine is already doing that, so thank you, Catherine, from College Station. We appreciate you. And anybody else who'd like to join her there, it's a great way for us to let our guests know that you are here, maybe which part of the country or the world that you are in, perhaps which organization you're with or what you do, all of that. Just pop that in the chat if you would, and then use that as a sandbox to play. We'll be monitoring that throughout, as well as the Q&A. So please do let us know that you're here. We would love to know that. So I of course, want to introduce our guest to you today. But before I do that, I want to thank our sponsor, DonorSearch, who has been providing a platform for these conversations here in London for the past 3 years, but also across the United States and sometimes in other places. And all of that is courtesy of the company's commitment to this kind of educational role that they play in the sector. And if you want to know more about, of course, the Philanthropy Mastermind series, you can check all that out under the resources tab on the DonorSearch site at DonorSearch.net. And while you're there, if you want to know more about your donors, and I suspect that you do, you can check out DonorSearch's services. But we won't be talking about that today. Unless our guest chooses to mention them to you, but you can learn all about them right there. So all of that's available to you, again, at DonorSearch.net. And once again, thanks to those of you who are joining us in the chat. Now, as I said, and you probably know already, today, our guest is Marina Jones. And Marina was kind enough to have volunteered to bring me into this incredible space at the English National Opera, one of the preeminent institutions for the arts in the UK. And we can't show all that to you because they're rehearsing over there and I can't carry a laptop around, but we can show you Barry. So before we begin with that, Marina, you are the executive director in charge of development here. That's a relatively new role, I believe, for you. When did you take this on?
10 days ago.
10 days ago.
It's still a very new role, yes.
Congratulations.
But I've been with the company a couple of years now.
Yes, and you've been in the arts field for
my whole professional life.
For a while, yeah. Yes. Royal Opera, I know, Polka Dot before that.
Theatre, yeah.
Yes.
Smith and the Orange Tree.
Right, lots of time in the opera.
Yes.
Particularly, is that why the opera?
That's a good question. I mean, the first opera I ever came to see was actually here, English National Opera at the London Coliseum when I was about 15. My parents quite enjoyed the opera and were friends of various places, but I came on a date with a first boyfriend and came and saw a show here. But I didn't fall in love with it immediately. It took a while to fall in love with opera. And then I've been working in fundraising and a job came up at the Opera House and it felt like a really great fit.
Well, it sounds like opera outlasted the boyfriend. What was the name of the opera? Maybe
it was Stacey Van Tutti.
Stacey Van Tutti. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Mozart here. And even if you didn't fall in love with opera immediately, obviously you had some affection for, I guess, the combination of not only what was appearing on the stage, but this whole thing that we know of as the performing arts.
Yeah, so I think, well, going right back, my mum and dad met in an amateur theatre production.
Oh.
I'm called Marina because my mother was in Pericles, Shakespeare's Pericles.
Oh.
And she played Marina's mother while she was pregnant with me. My father was also in it. And Marina in Pericles, the Shakespeare play, gets kidnapped by pirates and sold to a brothel, and then refuses to sleep with any of the patrons by trying to convert them to Christianity. So my journey is not quite that exciting, but sort of theatre has always been part of my life and my upbringing. My parents, again, continued amateur acting all the way through my childhood. So I've been on stage with 3 generations of my family. There's a theatre in the southwest of England near Land's End called the Minack Theatre that was carved into the cliff by this inspirational woman, Rowena Cade. So it's carved into the cliff, and the backdrop is the sea. So when I was 6, we did a production of Julius Caesar there, and me, my baby brother in arms, my mother, my grandfather were all on stage, and my father directed it. So yeah, growing up in theatre was always part of my life, and I think I never thought about, I knew I didn't want to do it professionally in an acting way, but it was so much part of my identity, and I think that's why I ended up working professionally in the administration side and then fundraising side of theatre. And then I think with opera, you've got the joy of live theatre, but with sort of added spectacle of music and scale sometimes, but sometimes you can have very small and tiny intimate operas. The other day I went to, there's a festival in London called Glyndebourne, which plays on the Festival of Glyndebourne, which is a sort of country house black tie grand opera. But Glyndebourne is in East London in a theatre for 80 people. So seeing a version of Mozart's Marriage of Figaro with 8 people in the cast and 8 people in the orchestra. And then later the same week going to the Royal Ballet and Opera House and seeing, you know, 80 people in the orchestra and 80 people on stage, but a really different scale. So I think that's what's really exciting with opera. You can have it tiny, but the power of the human voice to convey the emotion and the experiences and all of the feelings is pretty special.
It sounds pretty amazing that you can have both those things exist in a major metropolitan area today.
Yeah.
In the past in New York, there was the Amato Opera, which was the width of a DC-10. And so it's a very small audience and very small cast performing major operas on a small stage. And then there was the Met. But that's not true anymore. What is it about London, maybe the UK as a whole, but what is it about London that there's support for the arts in such a way that you can have the E&O and then you can have, you know, a small opera company, that you can have major productions and you can have tiny little set pieces, all supported by the public?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you've also got very different kind of economic models for these different kinds of opera experiences, some of which sit in a more subsidized space, and some of them are working at a more commercial scale, and some of them are beg, borrow and steal just because we love it so much we want to make it happen. In terms of London kind of being that melting pot, I suppose it's like any city, it's the brain drain of talent being in one city, that then you've got creative people who want to make those things happen. But sort of funneling it with Glyndebourne is a very festival in a set period of time. Yeah.
You mentioned though the economics of it, and I know that's not a straight line for any place, including London. And I know one of the things we can and probably should discuss is how you have made it through a very difficult time, not just at the but for the arts as a whole in Britain, as we have made our way through the pandemic. But could you talk a little bit about the economics of the E&O today? Like what is it, for those who can't see beyond these walls here, and Barry, how is the E&O supported? What kind of work does it produce and how is it supported?
Yeah, so we're in a theatre in St Martin's Lane in the centre of London, about 3-minute walk from Trafalgar Square, so right in the heart of the city. The London Coliseum was founded in 1904 by Oswald Stoll, who had a sort of empire of theatres across the country. It was originally set up as a sort of music hall variety space and wanted to be one of the biggest venues in London, and it is the biggest capacity. It's bigger than the Royal Ballet and the Opera House and the Palladium. So there are 2,359 seats in the auditorium, and the setting of where we are was a sort of a very strategic audience move by Oswald Stoll. He literally stood outside Charing Cross Station, which is a major kind of influx of where trains come in, and sort of ticked off where people were coming, and then worked out there are enough people coming into London from the sort of home counties, from Surrey, from out into Sussex, to warrant enough entertainment that they need something on the doorstep of the train station. So he sort of did this very strategic plan and then chose this plot of land because of that. So there's been a theatre on this site since 1904, but the English National Opera, as it was founded by Lillian Bayliss, who is a sort of inspirational theatrical producer whose work with Sadler's Wells, the Old Vic, the Young Vic, the Royal Ballet School, it founded a lot of these movements in the 1930s. And her vision was very much about opera for everyone. She wanted everyone to have that connection with opera, and that it should be affordable for the people, but also world class. And her sort of assemblage of both theatre, opera, created a lot of our kind of founding companies in England. So she is our founder. She was really, really passionate about opera, and a lot of beg, borrow and steal in the sort of economic model of how that company assembled. But English National Opera were at Sadler's Wells until 1968, and then from 1968 we've been resident here in the London Coliseum, and we really take that heritage of Lillian Bayliss and what we should be doing about opening up the possibilities of opera in people's lives in all sorts of ways. So that works with both the work we do on stage, and tickets are free for anyone under 21 to come and sit in any seat in the house.
You're too late.
And we have subsidised tickets for people who are under 35. We have relaxed performances for people with additional needs. We have school offers, but we also work a lot with education in terms of that, opening up that what could opera be. We have a fantastic programme which reaches about 20,000 people a year that looks at an unfinished piece of classical music and inviting children and young people to be composers, working with teachers to have lesson plans, and then they compose it, and then our orchestra perform it. And it's a fantastic thing. And the other thing, we mentioned the pandemic. A new thing that we invented during the pandemic was, in that real crisis response moment of we all need to feel some kind of agency, and we want to use whatever gifts and skills we've got to help what's going on in the world. We worked with our sort of singing repetiteurs who, when you're singing opera, the diaphragm and the control that opera singers have for their voice is so crucial. So that breath control, we worked with clinicians from the NHS, respiratory specialists, doctors, to found this program called Breathe, which works with people with long COVID and the anxiety and breathlessness associated with that long-term condition. And there's about an estimated 2 million people in the UK who are impacted by long COVID. But this is a free online course where you're medically assessed by a professional clinician to say it's safe for you to do it. But over 4,000 people have now taken part in that online Breathe, and have clinically proven. We've done a random controlled trial that's been published in the Lancet to show that this creative health intervention is really helping people to retrain their breathing, giving them exercise based on singing exercises and singing lullabies, because lullabies are soothing for you to sing or soothing for you to sing to someone else. And that's been a really fantastic creative use of the skills of opera, very much in line with our mission about opera being for everyone, but how do you use it for good in all sorts of ways, whether that's the beauty of a magical performance or in that Breathe project.
That sounds so beautiful. I mean, as a way of not just maintaining your relationship with all the potential audiences that are here, but expanding the audience and for people's interaction with the arts and its significance in their daily life, not just when they come to the theater, but when they're at home.
Yeah, and a lot of those people who've done Breathe have never been to the opera and don't have a connection with opera, and might have what we often do, that kind of like, that's not for me, that's not my cup of tea. But people have fallen in love with it because we've also invited them to come and see performances here through the program. They're also doing their own creative singing, and we've had them on stage. We had 87 participants who have been through the program singing some lullabies that they created as well before one of our performances, and that was very special. And I think particularly for the participants, because it's an online program, they've not met in real life, but they've had this very intense experience, and part of it is that pastoral connection of, these are people like me who are suffering from this condition that we we're all still learning about, but they've connected through this, and they've formed these communities. And then actually on the day, you know, there were a lot of tears, because these people had spent, you know, months being online together and never seen each other face to face, and then they're standing on stage in the beautiful auditorium and being able to sing together.
You know, it strikes me as you're discussing that one of the topics that we've talked about in the arts a lot has to do with audience retention, because much of it is virtual. So whether it's people who were in their homes because they were recovering from long COVID, or whether it's because they were raised in an atmosphere where either opera wasn't their thing, as you said, or maybe they just experienced the arts and entertainment through a screen. That one of the challenges maybe is the size of the house. It doesn't seem like that's been a major issue here, or has it?
I mean, from 1906, there are people complaining that the building is too big for what it should be, and that you need a different kind of vocal attack for that kind of size.
From a performance perspective.
From a performance perspective, as well as from an audience perspective. I think what the E&O is really good at, and I think would say it's like the gateway drug for opera. It is where people find that first love of opera. And we're really proud of the fact that 56% of our audiences each year are first-time attenders. So because I think we have that ethos about it being for everyone, we're able to be that welcoming place that people can take that first step, because we have affordable prices, because we have those free offers. I think we work really hard to make it a space that you feel you could cross that threshold and come into. The other thing I just want to mention, we're talking about pandemic and finding that way away from the screen and into a real performance. During the pandemic, E&O did a drive-in opera called Drive-In Live. So up at Alexandra Palace in London, people would come to the opera in their car like you would for a drive-in movie, and then could tune their radio to listen to the live music. So really using the passion that we have to share this wonderful art form with people, but finding those really creative solutions, because the world was like it was, but also actually, is it less threatening to try an opera in a car park than it is to step across the threshold of a grand Edwardian theatre?
Meeting people where they are.
Yeah.
And well, that's in a sense, I mean, even the program is that way, because it may be opera, and opera may not be everyone's taste until they acquire that taste. But opera spans a lot of years and a lot of things, including a lot of languages. So here I understand that, I mean, one of the things I think about when I think of the E&O, of course, is Gilbert and Sullivan, which I know is only one slice of this, but it's a very important slice.
Yeah, and we have Pirates of Penzance coming on this Christmas. We had Iolanthe last year. So yes, we have a real tradition of performing high quality Gilbert and Sullivan, and some of the productions of Gilbert and Sullivan have been with us for decades. And I think one of the interesting things with opera is quite often you have a production, and it's not like the theatre where you do your 6 weeks and then you stop. You have that run of the production, and then you kind of put it back in the cupboard, and then it comes back 2 years later or 5 years later. So people are seeing the same production again and again and again. And with our Pirates of Penzance, which was directed by Mike Lee, who is a huge Gilbert and Sullivan expert and fan, they've seen this production. So if you're coming to the first time, you're having this amazing time. But also, if you love Gilbert and Sullivan or Philip Glass, you're seeing the same production year on year. And that visual kind of anchor to how you see in your mind this story told again and again can be really important. So we've got La Boheme, which opens our season, which is a Jonathan Miller production, which again has been with us for decades. So we find people who've never seen another one, because they always come here and they always see our version, or they see a different one, but in their head and in their heart, when they're thinking of Mimi and Rodolfo and La Boheme, they're thinking it looks like that, because that's what it looks like at the
And that's in English as well.
That's in English. So we do, the vast majority of work is in English. And I think one interesting thing with opera, in the 1920s, you always performed it in the language of the people, and it's a later thing that moved, but also you had it in the language of whatever the singer was. So there are performances where if you were a German singer, you sang your part in German. If you were French, you'd sing your part in French. And if you were a British, you would sing in English.
Right.
So you have these sort of polyglot performances. But for, singing in English is about making it more accessible. And what we find as well with the artists that sing it is their emotional connection, they say, is much greater in your understanding what you're saying. We make a couple of exceptions for that. So we do Philip Glass's Akhenaten, which is written in Sanskrit and various ancient Egyptian languages. So that is done as Philip Glass wrote it, but the narrator parts and the scribe and certain bits are in English. And there are a couple of other things. We did Gorecki's Symphony of Sorrowful Songs, and because that's based on a prayer, we kept that in the original language. So there are a couple of things for artistic reasons or that we keep in the original language.
There's a lot we've covered already, and I want to make sure that for those who are listening and learning along with me, that we also have a door open to you. So I'd be very interested to know if, for example, if you all want to just let us know in the chat, whether or not you're working for or with an arts organization right now, especially performing arts organization, and if any of this resonates for you, especially what maybe you've lived through the past 4 years. I know one of the challenges we've had in the United States, and I understand you've had it in Britain as well, is that there's a certain amount of funding in the US at the national, the state, and sometimes the local level for artistic productions. And the rest is a matter of where we can come up with the funding. It's certainly not going to be subsidized entirely by ticket sales. It just, at least for us, that has not been the winning formula. So it had to be some combination of support from governmental entities, sponsors, ticket sales, subscribers, different things. But then when we were hit with this once in a century challenge, it kind of threw out the rule books, and we had to find lots of new ways of engaging with audiences, meeting where they are, but also offering new services like you did with health. That's the first time I've heard that. But also trying to find a new formula for raising money on the interim and then retaining those donors once we started to reemerge. What was it like for you at the E&O?
Well, during the pandemic, I was actually at the Royal Opera House.
So speaking to it from the Royal Opera House perspective.
So I was head of membership and appeals. So I was looking after 25,000 members and not having a building that was open. Right. And I think, again, that pivot was the word of the pandemic, wasn't it? Of being able to find ways to continue to engage and, Zoom meetings with people. I remember getting our chief executive to do an event for all of our legacy pledges. And we did a special event, and there were 2 ladies who lived together in the same residential care home, and they took a picture of them having afternoon tea with champagne, watching the CEO on that. So I think finding those ways where we all connected with donors, we had to open ourselves up and be more transparent and more open because everything was more fluid. And for us, thinking about it at the Royal Ballet and the Opera, the pressures with artists, and when things are filmed, they're there forever. And in a performance, it's very ethereal. And if you make a mistake or if something happens, it's there for that second, but you're not living with it forever. And that real anxiety from performers of how their art comes across in a different way. For singers, Zoom is not a great medium for the operatic voice. And to get that resonance and depth and being able to find opportunities that worked and shared things together. At English National Opera, they created E&O TV, which was a weekly Zoom television show, which really just showcased all the work of the company. So being able to invite people from the wigs, from makeup, from the music library, all of, I always think an opera house is like a village, all of the people from the village to be able to talk about and share their work and their expertise. And it became a kind of moment in everyone's life because it was weekly, it was on a Wednesday, people would be there with their glass of wine or their dinner in the same spot. You were creating an event. You weren't just posting a video. Yeah, and it was that community. You could see the people that were with you and being part of that. And that, I think, those sorts of things kept people together. But I think what's really important in all kind of arts fundraising, but all fundraising, is that connection with the thing that you have the passion about, which for us is opera. So being able to give people more of what they love, and perhaps, you know, from a slightly different angle, because you can't do the whole performance, but you can talk to a violinist about what it's like to play in the pit when you can't actually see what's happening on stage, and you can, you know, or something falls off the stage and lands on you sometimes, you know, being able to share those stories and have an openness and transparency, which I think sometimes organizations didn't have before the pandemic, and it shifted to say, you know, we need to have that much more open dialogue.
That's very interesting, because one of the things I always wonder about, and I try to ask people about, is not only what did we encounter and how do we deal with it at the time, but then what did we learn from it and what do we continue to retain? So one of the obvious ones is retaining donors, and I'd still love to hear how things are on the other end of that for both the Royal Opera and for the E&O and others. But another part is just what you were alluding to, and that is that, okay, we did something that we hadn't done before because we either needed to or we thought it was the right way to cope with this and provide this service, this essential offering. But then afterwards, did we stop doing those things? So how have the major arts organizations, especially the opera companies, held on to that kind of innovative nature of coping with the pandemic now in order to continue to attract new and different audiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think for E&O, it's so much part of the DNA that you use the tools of opera and what you have to reach people wherever they are, and that you're constantly finding those reinvention moments of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. So we did a prom with, which is a mixture of Handel and Philip Glass. So both of those use the very high male countertenor voice. So the countertenor Anthony Roth Constanza. So it had orchestra. It was in a club warehouse in East London called Printworks. You had a beatboxer as part of it. You had a live performance, someone who was painting, and you had commissioned pieces of artwork there as well. So finding all of these ways that you can open up opera to a new audience, and also that your core audience will still want to engage with and choose to engage with as well. The other event we had here in December, the performance artist Marina Abramovich produced her opera experience, which was the 7 Deaths of Maria Callas, which she performs in, but also you've got 7 arias from work by Maria Callas is famous for, performed with videos created with Willem Dafoe and Marina Abramovich. So again, you're using that operatic form to invite a different audience in, because you're just doing something completely different, but you're using perhaps the draw of Willem Dafoe will work for someone, or they're a fan of Marina Abramovich, or they're a fan of this piece. So there's all sorts of ways that you're finding to bring those people in, and then looking at how that works for your core audience and how do you make it extra special. So you've got, we had the wonderful experience of having Marina Abramovich with us for that, which was amazing, and she very kindly did a dinner on stage, which we had as a donor event. So we had her, you know, the curtain rose and she was there just and you were in a replica of Maria Callas's Parisian apartment for a very intimate dinner on stage. So that connection with the art, but also finding the different people who might want to have those different experiences with that art form.
And I guess you wouldn't know unless you tried it. I mean, unless you held the dinner on stage and you saw the response.
And I think that's, you know, there's a huge amount of kind of creative collaboration, and the attitude within a performing arts company gives you that creative freedom to be able to say, we take risks in how we create our art. We need to take that through into our fundraising and be able to have a little bit of creative risk. And if it doesn't work, we don't do it again, or if it doesn't work, you don't have to do it as a whole event, but actually being able to be brave around some of those things and try them, but being able to use the kind of creative expertise of the other people who work in this building and can do amazing things, and say, oh, actually, no, we want to do this with the lights, or we want to do that, not just plonk a table there. We can make it a proper full-on artistic donor experience.
It strikes me also that you may be, the company may be creating these new and innovative works, but at the same time, they sound largely accessible. I mean, even if it's Philip Glass and it's in Sanskrit, it's Philip Glass. There's an accessibility to the work. If you're performing La Boheme, I mean, I know it's part of the standard repertoire, but as you're pointing out, not everybody listens to opera. But performing it in English makes it to some degree more accessible. Bringing something into a warehouse space where you have all this different stuff going on makes it accessible for lots of different audiences who may not otherwise encounter opera. So the accessibility seems to be important. How is that translated into the fundraising component when you're making these things possible for people to go and sit and eat on the stage, or to buy a ticket at a discounted price, or you're trying to bring in younger audiences or older audiences? And are you able to then retain their involvement, their engagement, their interest?
Yeah, and I think we try and do that as all arts organizations and charities do in lots of different ways. And I think it's been interesting, particularly post-pandemic, where audiences are. And we did a great focus group with our legacy supporters the end of last year, and they're so mission aligned to where we are in terms of that accessibility thing, that I think they fundamentally get the DNA of the company in terms of making opera accessible, and they're so loyal and joyful to speak to because they're so committed. I think that's really important, that alignment that people have with your values and mission. And once they're with you, they're with you for the long term, and that's very, very special.
Yeah. I want to make sure I'm not ignoring people who are here with us. We did have a couple comments earlier from Pat and Catherine. I want to thank you for those and just touch on them briefly and make sure. Pat had mentioned that their organization is not an arts organization, but they use music and visual art in their programs for adults who are developmentally challenged. So again, that kind of cross pollination of different kinds of programmatic types, which I loved in your description about working with NHS, the National Health Service here, in order to bring programs for people who have encountered long COVID, but also just the anxiety of long COVID, which was something that I thought was a fascinating component of that. And I haven't heard about people doing that in the States. And if anybody knows otherwise, I'd love to know.
I do. Rennie Fleming, the opera singer, has done a lot of breath work as well, quite similar.
And is that being then organizationally distributed?
I know she's got a company or a not-for-profit that does some work, but she's done an awful lot with breath control and breathing for people with COVID as well.
Well, I guess we can always use more publicity of good programs like that. And then we had the note from Catherine saying that that we are grad assistants in the developmental office for the Performance, Visualization, and Fine Arts College at Texas A&M, and also working on issues related to art therapy, mental health issues. So please do feel free to keep those comments coming, or to go ahead and ask questions if you have them. I know that there was also a time of retrenched funding from the government for some organizations in the US, I believe here. Is that something that you've been able to overcome at the E&O, the Royal Opera, and other organizations? How have you weathered that storm?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just for context, I suppose the sort of performing arts kind of ecology and funding situation in the UK versus America. We have more government subsidy probably than America, and our reliance on philanthropic income is developing. And I think that there are some interesting things around evolving business models. We're lucky if you have a venue and a theatre to be able to try and maximize the use of that venue to get more income, so that you can create more art and more opera, and whether that's filming The Crown or filming adverts, being able to use that commercial exploitation, commercial hire. With the English National Opera, we have an opera season where our orchestra and chorus are performing, but we also have visiting companies that come in, and we use the revenue from that to help subsidize that. And I think all arts organizations are trying to work smarter in terms of having a more sustainable mixed portfolio. And I think that was the interesting thing with the pandemic. In Britain, the government had a cultural recovery fund, and a furlough scheme, which meant that quite a lot of organisations were much better off than they could have been with that. But depending on different business models, the pandemic hit worse. But if you could mothball and not do very much, then different things. But with the Royal Ballet and Opera, where I was, fundraising had to continue. The amount of fundraised income is so important to the company, and our donors are so important to us, that we needed to keep those relationships and keep people engaged all the way through.
About how much of the pie is it for the E&O, individual or?
So the E&O in terms of fundraised income is about 12%. In terms of the Royal Ballet and Opera, it's about 25%. And then on top of that, you've got Arts Council, which is the main kind of government subsidy for organisations.
And then it's a matter of selling tickets.
Then it's selling
and
tickets
sponsorship
and commercial exploitation.
Yes.
Yeah, I think for most UK arts organisations, sponsorship comes in the fundraising pie.
Yes.
Number.
Now, I keep ignoring the golden friend. So can you tell us about him? Because it does relate to what we're talking about.
It does, yes. So this is Barry, and the sign above his head actually says, Barry says, Opera Without Limits, help E&O share the magic of opera by tapping to donate today. So this is a contactless donation point. And probably about 6 months ago, these were sort of around the building, but they didn't really stick out. They looked like where you should pay for your drinks or pay for your ice cream. So they weren't doing good business for us. They were a bit lost. Barry appeared in a 2019 production of The Merry Widow, which is quite silly, or very silly, comic opera set in
Bach, I think, right?
Lehar.
Is it like Lehar?
It's very silly. It was a very lively production. It's set in a sort of like a state equivalent to Luxembourg, but a made-up one. Called Ponte Vecchio, and the symbol of this state was this golden beaver called Barry. There were people at points in the opera dressed up in sort of full plushy costumes of Barry, and we've got about 3 of these that were made for the production. They were front of house just for fun during the production and appeared on stage. But when we were thinking about how we were going to get this box here to do a little bit more business for us and attract attention for audiences in a kind of busy front of house environment, we were talking to props and costume, because I always think you've got to connect it with the art of the thing that someone loves, and so we decided that Barry could help us with our fundraising efforts. He's been tucked away here today because what should I say, we're in the Harewood room, which is one of our small entertaining hospitality spaces. But we've had front of house maintenance, so he's tucked away, but he will go out. So yeah, since we've put our donation box with Barry, we've definitely seen our donations go up in terms of just visitors and audiences being able to tap to give. I'm really excited, and I've only seen it today, but we're looking this season. For every opera, Barry will be in costume. So for each production, our very amazing people in our hats department have made Barry a hat, and there will be a hat that you can try on and take your picture. And again, just trying to really make it fun and to kind of democratize, encouraging everyone to be able to make small donations for having a fun moment with Barry. So the first opera of the season is La Bohème. In the story, Rodolfo buys Mimi a pink bonnet when they go out shopping on Christmas Eve. So Barry has a little tiny pink bonnet, and there is a sort of pink bonnet that will be attached, so you can put it on as well. So that's the kind of fundraising. It's a bit silly, but I think it makes people stand out. It makes it a bit more interesting. And then for each show, there is a different hat that Barry will be wearing, and one that you can try on as well. So it's just trying to bring a bit of fun and make people smile. And Barry makes people smile anyway, because he is a giant gold beaver.
I think he's hilarious. And I mean, I can imagine it's something like this. Like you said, it democratizes things, not just in terms of making it possible for small donations, but it just, again, it makes everything accessible. There's no reason why sporting events should be the only people who have a giant whatever animal around, and it doesn't diminish the rest of the work to have it. I mean, it's funny. I know a big part of your own work with Rogare and personally is the history of philanthropy, which goes back a long way. and it dovetails with some of the things we discussed yesterday in our session. But one thing that comes to mind, and it's only one tiny example, is that, of course, Mozart was writing plays, or rather operas, in German, which was a matter of many things, but also accessibility, I believe. And so writing operas for the people, I mean, that's the magic flute. So I wonder, when it comes to the history of fundraising and thinking about every kind of tool and technique that is in our bag and maybe should be in our bag in order to welcome everybody into this party that we're enjoying with opera, what are some of the things that you see as a through line from the earliest days of philanthropy to today that really give us the inspiration that we need in order to be less, I don't know, less static in our fundraising?
I think one thing that's been kind of a constant in that history of fundraising is that real trying to make it really tangible what your support does. So we do it in the theatre, we do a campaign and we look at, how much does a wig cost? Or we need to give someone motorbike lessons because they have to drive on a really fancy motorbike, or we need to buy a rose or a cake. So you're really tangibly supporting that thing. And the earliest examples we have of that are sort of in the 12th century with people building cathedrals and being able to say, you can pay for a day's labor, you can pay for a window and have your name on it, and really breaking down all of those sort of elements, because I think we as people really have that tangible need to know, I did that. I want to know that I did that thing. Make me feel good and special, that I'm kind and generous and I've made my contribution. And there's a great one of a cathedral where they were doing a local collection, and it's sort of like, obviously someone was really mean and didn't put in for the collection. So inscribed in this sort of book commemorating everyone who did things for the cathedral, it's like, everyone gave but Giovanni. And it's sort of, it's from a 12th century Italian cathedral, but this sort of donor shaming has sort of stuck out.
Wow.
But then you get sort of beautiful and other lovely examples of people being really connected, or people give a day's labor. That physically means give a day's labor, or people give the money for someone else to do it.
And it's not all for the naming, though, is it? Or the face in the stained glass? No,
and I think, you get a lot of kind of healthy competition, like different bits of the city are trying to compete against each other. And now in fundraising, we see this kind of drive around gamification of how can you make it really fun and engaging, and you get those kind of rewards of like, ping, I've done that thing. So you see that in the behaviors that people had then, where it was just like, literally, I want to be, that street over there because we want to prove that we're more kind and we're more generous.
I'm wondering, as we discuss that, if there are things that you are imagining that you need to implement going forward, or maybe that you would recommend to others, especially in the States, as we think about how the arts can be more not just innovative in terms of fundraising, but maybe are more in tune with emerging generations. Because you mentioned gamification, and that comes to mind right away. Is that people under 40, let's say, that's kind of a broad demographic, but people under 40 are more than, I think, in fact, people under 27 are a third of the US population, something outrageous, like 130 million people. So when you're dealing with younger audiences, what are the ways that you see as being the most effective in engaging those people and meeting them where they are, not trying to get them to do what we want, but doing more of what makes sense for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it's about building that audience and having that experience, and where in society you have that opportunity of you with your parents, with your school, with those things, because I think particularly arts and culture become so much part of your identity and who you are and how you define yourself as a person. When I was doing research around legacy givers at the Opera House, all of the people who we interviewed in this big oral history project had all had a first experience under the age of 22. So you've got to have that magical experience and that point in your life where you're defining who you are as being separate from, school child or family. You're becoming the adult and the human that you will be. And it's finding those moments so you become part of people's lives in that space. And there's some research that says your musical taste gets fixed by the age of 23 and a half. So, you know, if you're not exposed to a certain type of music, or if that's why certain pop songs you still know all the words to, and, you know, modern music sounds awful because that point is the cutoff point. Not, you know, universally, but that kind of fixed point that in terms of exposure is really important. And if we're not having music in schools, if we're not having people who have that opportunity to have that experience, whether they like it, you know, it's perfectly valid also not to like it, but if you don't have that opportunity, it can't grow into something that you are connected with and want to be part of. And I think for me, there's something about that tribal building of connection and community, which we have as a shared experience as an audience. You know, one of the strangest things going back into a theatre space towards, you know, a pause in the pandemic was the socially distant seating, and how a 40% filled with spaces between you theatre, even everyone clapping for their lives because they're just so glad to be back, sounds so different. It sounds, you know, it just
almost empty.
But everyone is also clapping, you can feel the energy. But that connection of being together in a live space and being able to hear, to interact, to talk to someone next to you, to hear someone whisper something really strange, of, you know, is part of the experience. And I think we have to find those ways to give people those experiences so they can have that connection.
So is it up to us? I mean, in the United States, there is a dearth now funding at the local level for arts and music education programs.
Yes.
And there are lots of reasons.
Yeah.
So if it's not happening there, is it a matter of, I don't know, finding a way to bring the kids into a performance here? And is that something that then it's up to the E&O and the Royal Opera and everybody else to drag them in, because our schools just either aren't able or don't have the funding to do so?
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, it's a big piece where philanthropy comes in to support those opportunities. You know, the schools program, family performances at the Royal Ballet are all supported by individual philanthropists. We have a very open, free access scheme. It's finding those opportunities, but also supporting people to have the confidence to do it. Because if you're the school teacher and you don't feel that maybe opera is something that you will understand, or you'll feel stupid in front of a class full of children because you don't know what's going on, that you need to be able to support people to have those introductions and say, this is a place for you. This is a place we meet you where you are. You know, you might not like it, you might hate it, you know. And I think with the range of things you get in opera, you could see a Philip Glass, and that could really, you know, some people find it's not their kind of music. Some people can't do Gilbert and Sullivan. Some people hate Wagner. Some people, you know, there is a type of it for everything. I always think, you know, it's like someone saying I don't like books, but you know, there are so many, you know, because you've read one book, I don't like books, you know, because the experiences are so different. Sure. You could get we had an opera called Blue that was set in an African American community where there'd been a police shooting. Tiny cast of 10. I made the mistake of not taking a hanky and then cried all the way through the second half, and just you know, incredibly emotional, incredibly powerful performances. But we also had the opera of The Handmaid's Tale, so you've got a very contemporary, you know, intense story, very intense music that wasn't suitable. Not everyone enjoyed. It's not a glass of wine enjoying of an evening kind of music. It's very intense, as you would expect from that story. So being able to have that full range of experience, as well as, you know, the classic pieces of repertoire that many of us really, really love.
Well, it just strikes me, even talking with you about this, that your first experiences, I think, sort of like mine, were very early. And it was participating in a play, which it was for me too, or as a child, or a small musical at church. And then our school went to the Metropolitan Opera as a field trip. They also went to a baseball game, but they also went to the Metropolitan Opera. I don't think that I would have been exposed to opera had the school not taken that trip. And you were right there performing with family. So exposed through your own family. It sounds like those are, I guess, decisions we make, that this is important. And so we have to undertake it. But it does mean, I guess, as people in fundraising, that there's also a responsibility to look for support for the educational function in a way maybe that's even perhaps more important than it was in the past.
I mean, I think for a lot of British companies, that education piece is so central to the remit because of that responsibility to connect with audiences now and where they are. And for English National Opera, you know, that education piece sits within our artistic program because it's so important and it's central to what we do.
If people do come to London, and I'm sure we'll have some people who are either with us live or watch this later, who are interested in visiting this beautiful, beautiful place, how can people learn more about the English National Opera?
You can go to eno.org is our website. The season starts on the 26th of September with La Bohème, but we also have Benjamin Britten's Turn of the Screw, The Elixir of Love, Rigoletto, the Pirates of Penzance, Marriage of Figaro. So we've got a whole range of performances to see.
And I'm sure you'll enjoy all of that. Also, you can just check out online all the work that they do. Jack has put a link in so you can take a look at that. And maybe, I don't know if you have a list to sign up to be on your mailing list. I'm sure you maintain that. And if you're lucky, maybe you can come here and meet Barry. And if people want to follow your work with Rogare or others, how can people learn more about the work that you do?
So I have a website, marinajones.uk, where I write quite a lot about the history of fundraising and blend that with kind of understandings about behavioral economics and decision science. So you can find quirky bits of random history, but also just really interesting things to say, you know. On the Bear Tapestry from 1066, there are fundraisers on the Bear Tapestry. So just really interesting things like that. Yeah, there are two people standing beside a procession with bags of money, collecting money from the crowd.
Okay, well, that's one that we obviously, I wish I could just, you know, take a look at a picture of that right now, but there is a link to your page right there. So everybody click on that before we disappear today. I want to thank you very much, Marina, for welcoming us here and for sharing all this about your journey, but also the work that you do here. Thank you who are live with us, as well as those who are viewing the recording later, for taking this journey with us, for visiting with Barry. And I want to encourage you to also join us again tomorrow. We have two folks who are in the prospect research and prospect development space, working with the Prince's Trust and with UNICEF. Both former chairs of RIF, or Researchers in Fundraising, which is the equivalent of APRA here in Britain. Do check that out. That's at 11 a.m. Eastern, or you can watch that recording as well. But I want to thank you for joining us, and I'll look forward to seeing you then. Till then, take care.